there are two specific things I want to ask you about that, which is, you talk about the fact there's a line in the book which is in response to a question that a doctor is asking you, and the context is that your mother's been in hospital and she's been unwell, but she's actually made a pretty decent recovery, and at this point you're thinking, okay, I need to pack up her things and we need to plan to go home, and then you get this call that says that she's had a stroke, and in your mind, and again you convey this so well, there's this total impossibility in your head. You're thinking, she's due out in 3 days, what do you mean? That can't be possible, you know, she's better. And there's suddenly these people that's giving you this information that's saying not only is she not better, but there is no way that she's going to get better. And then you're left with this decision where the doctor, the line in the book is, he's telling me to decide how and when my mum should die. And it's just sort of devastating thing to be asked, because there are these two different options open to you. One is medical intervention that will prolong her life, but with ostensibly no quality of life, but potentially for quite a number of months. And then the alternative is ostensibly to let nature take its course, and that might be something that will take 3 days or so. And you're suddenly given this question and you have to answer it. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's got to be one of the most difficult decisions you will make in your life, is to choose how and when a loved one will die, when they can't make that decision for themselves. And if maybe they could, they certainly can't convey it to you.
No.
And the responsibility of that is almost overwhelming. It's also an impossible decision to make. At the same time, you've got to make it. So all that I could do is to reflect on her and on her life and on the way she had lived and the way she'd chosen to live so independently, so alone for the last years of her life. But as a young woman, she'd been different to the other women. She was the first woman to ever wear a pair of trousers in her village, you know, and she'd lived a very strong internal life for most of her life. And that in those last years after my father died, she'd lived alone when nobody thought she'd be able to manage alone. She had lived alone perfectly well and relished that independence that she had. And she was 90, but she still lived alone, completely alone, without any help. And bearing that in mind, and that's what I was reflecting on, you know, through the past with my relationship with her, what a strong woman she'd been. That was she able to make that choice for herself? That I hoped I was making a decision that she would make for herself, based on that reflection on her and her life. And that's something you can never know. You can never know that that is the right decision to make. It's really strange to ask me that question, because just yesterday, I received a letter from a lady who'd gone through exactly the same experience with her mother, exactly the same decision to make. And they too had chosen to take her mother home. We couldn't take my mum home because she was too ill, but they'd chosen to take her mother home and allow her to die as she chose to. And the doubts and the self-questioning and the guilt and everything that she felt, even now, years after, will always be there, because it's a question that can't be answered, because the only person who could answer it is gone.
Yeah, no one's ever gonna take that burden off your shoulders. But again, you know, hearing you articulate it so well and so beautifully, I think it is of huge reassurance. And I imagine people do get in contact with you a lot about that part of the book. I think it's an extraordinary piece of writing, and very brave, actually. I mean, I've said this to you before. What I think is interesting about you is that you are obviously quite a private person, and you're an introvert. And to put these things on the page with such honesty is incredible, I think. And it'd be interesting to know whether you've feel like you've come to terms with that process, in fact, whether or not that's something you're more comfortable with now? You've written, obviously you wrote the first book without that in your mind. This was just a gift, a sort of loving gift to Moth. Whereas now you've written another book, and I imagine you're starting writing your next book. Is that something that's in your mind now, about the sense that your life is public, and how do you go about choosing what to keep personal?
It's really difficult balance, really. As you say, The Salt Path was written without any of those thoughts in my head. But when I came to write The Wild Silence, there was a huge weight of expectation, not only from the publishers, but also from people who'd read The Salt Path. And I found that almost crushing. It's almost stopped me being able to write. Because I was so conscious of it being read. And after a few months of wrestling with that and finding that what I was producing in that consciousness of the reader wasn't what I wanted to say, I realised that I had to put all those thoughts of who might read it or not out of my head entirely, and just write in the way I'd written The Salt Path, which was entirely as if nobody would read it, or maybe one person would read it. So that's what I had to do. And as soon as I put myself back into that frame of mind, A Wild Silence became completely possible to actually write. So now I've just started the third book, and again, wrestling with the same conundrum. What do I include? What do I leave out? And I think actually anyone who's read The Salt Path knows the worst of me now anyway. They know things about me I probably shouldn't have shared. So what is there to hold back now? I don't know.
Just returning briefly to that section in the early stages of The Wild Silence that talks about your mother's death. You also, one of the things about it, I think that's quite painful but also fascinating, is the fact that you're almost talking about it as foreshadowing what you know is going to come at some point with your experience with Moth. And I wondered, it must be 10 years or so now since that first diagnosis was made with Moth. And at the time, obviously there must have been that sort of terrifying adrenaline rush of, we've got to grasp hold of these last few moments together. The more the years go on, the more you must obviously feel optimistic about, things being okay. How long does that shadow of that diagnosis cast over the subsequent events? Does it still tick over in the back of your minds?
I think it's a diagnosis that will never go away. Although we've found ways to help his health, for his health to improve in ways that we've been told were impossible. The diagnosis doesn't go away. And if we don't keep walking, if we don't keep him active and moving and deal with life in the ways that we've found actually seem to work, then his symptoms come back very quickly and quite aggressively. So it's a diagnosis that never goes away. So we live with that on a daily basis. The shock of the early days of that diagnosis have faded away. And now we're left in more of a state of reality, that this is a real thing, that it is part of our everyday existence, and it will be part of when those everydays no longer exist. But there's a coming to terms with that now, I think, that wasn't there in the beginning when the diagnosis was so raw